All right, hi everybody, and we'll start with welcoming Rebbitzin Wolf back because the lunch and learn hasn't been the same without her. So we're gonna actually explore both the Parsha and Shavuos today. So double double chance. I'm not sure if there's gonna be a class next week, so we had to get in Shavuos before Shavuos. And it happens to be that these Parshias discuss the Jewish people approaching Midbar Sinai. So we went through that's sort of the story that is told, and it says like when we came Bahar, the Parsha Bahar Bechukaisai, which are the Parshias that we are reading this week. Bahar, which Har is it referring to? That Hashem told all these commandments, and Moshe taught the Jewish people at which mountain? This is referring to Har Sinai. So some of my favorite talks of the Rebbe are the ones where he talks about double parshias and how they're connected to each other. So we know that depending on whether it's a leap year or not a leap year, or sometimes it doesn't have to do so much if it's a leap year or not, just certain years we need to fill in depending on the amount of Shabbosim that there are from Simchas Torah to Simchas Torah, we need to fill in certain parshias. So sometimes we double them up. And Bahar and Bechukaisai are doubled up this year. We read them together. It's like one long parsha. And to the extent that in Shul, when we're reading the Torah, it's actually one aliyah that goes from the end of Parshas Bahar and into Parshas Bechukaisai. So it's not like there's a break. Okay, we have the aliyah, and then we finish Parshas Bahar, and then a new person is called up for Parshas Bechukaisai to start a new reading. But it's actually just one, it extends. We sort of extend one Parsha into the next. And that's said under one bracha. And so that kind of teaches us that these Parshias that are connected, it's not just because some of them happen to be a little shorter. So it's like, oh, well, they're connected because they're both a little shorter. But it's not just random because of length that they're connected. There is something contained within the content of the Parsha that is meant to also go together. That there's some relationship between these two Parshias. And especially from the Rebbe's perspective, where nothing in Torah is ever random. Nothing is ever arbitrary. And if there's a connection in physical space, there must be a connection below the surface as well. So we're going to talk about that. And from the Rebbe's view, how he often will discuss this is by looking at the names of the Parsha. Because we know, similar to the concept that we were just saying, that we know that the name represents the essence of the Parsha. In general, in Judaism, we say the name represents the content of what is within it. So even every person, your name is significant. It says that your parents have Ruach HaKodesh. When they choose your name, they have a small bit of prophecy when they're choosing your name, because your name represents something about you. And with the Parsha as well, even though the names of the Parshias were sort of created by people, right? The way that we colloquially started to refer to them, being that this has become the Jewish tradition and how we refer to the Parsha, it becomes absolutely significant. And it has real meaning, and we can't just dismiss it. So let's look at the names of these two Parshias. We have Parshas Bahar, which literally means by the mountain. And then we have Parshas Bechukaisai. Bechukaisai means in my Bechukaisai, with my statutes. And when we look at these two words, we see that they actually sort of connote two different movements, two sort of seemingly opposite movements. Bahar, mountain, seems to represent a certain sense of expansiveness, largesse, something that's big, that's tall, that states its existence in a very big way. It's very obvious. It's here in front of you, and it's big, and it's tall, and it's not hiding. It's not subservient. It is what it is. And it's, like we read in Pirkei Avos, it says, Heve az kanamer. Be, Heve az kanamer ve kal kanesher ratzkatzvi ve gibor kari. And when we're saying that, we're saying Heve az there's a space in Judaism for presenting ourselves with strength and with bigness, right? And that's the image of the har, and the movement of the har is this element of being big. Versus Bechukaisai talks about the chukim. The chukim are the laws of the Torah that we don't understand. So there are laws that we do understand and that make sense to our human minds. And then there are laws that also we can understand, like the very basic laws that make sense. We've discussed this a number of times. Moral, ethical laws of don't kill, don't steal, things like that. They're logical. Other societies have come to them on their own as well because they make a lot of sense. And then there are also laws that make sense within a cultural dynamic, like Shabbos, resting because Hashem rested. So it's not a chayk, but it makes sense. The Yamim Tovim, which represent certain momentous occasions for the Jewish people, they make sense that we're celebrating them the same way you would celebrate and commemorate special times with your family. But then there are laws that transcend reason and don't make sense. Some of the famous ones are Shatnez, Para Aduma, in general, the laws of purity and impurity. They're not rational, they're not logical, and they do not seem to make any sense. And about these types of laws, it says, Chuka chakakti, gzera gazarti, Hashem says, I have established a chayk and I have commanded a decree, and you are not allowed to, there's no space for you to be exploring this, to try to make sense of it. This is the law. When a parent says, because I said so, right? So God says about the chukim, it's sort of like Hashem saying, because I said so. And so what does that activate within us? What movement does that activate within us? That activates within us the movement of what we would call bittul, of letting go of my own knowledge, my own head, my own intellect, my own sense of self, my own sense of being, and recognizing that there is something larger than myself. Recognizing that, because if I didn't recognize there was something larger than myself, then why would I do this? Sometimes we find ourselves doing things that don't make sense. And if you really think about it, you're like, why am I doing these things that don't make sense? Why am I doing things that are self-destructive and make no sense? And they're for no reason. They're actually not for something. They're just because we're not being intentional. But with these chukim, it's a very intentional setting aside of my own personal self. It's very intentional. You would not, no one, I think none of us would, keep a mitzvah of like Taras HaMishpacha just by choice because we want to. It's because Hashem said so. And I recognize that there's something that's bigger than me. None of us just desire to not wear woolen linen. No, it's not coming from within your own rational desire. It's only because Hashem said so. And so we have these two movements. We have the movement of Bahar, of being a mountain, of being strong and expansive and declaring myself as taking up space. And then we have the movement of Bechukaisai, which is about seemingly maybe making myself smaller, not taking into account who I am, pushing myself aside a little bit. And they seem to contradict each other. And we said that if these two parshas are sort of connected, and they're physically connected as they are this year, that means that there's a deeper connection to them as well. It's not just the physical connection, there's a deeper connection as well. So how can it be that we have these two opposing movements in one parsha? You would say, okay, there's a space for this at times, and there's a space for that at times. But then they should be in two separate parshas, right? There are times when you're supposed to stand up and be strong, and there are times when you're supposed to be subservient and have bittul. But if that was the case, then we should separate them. So if they're both going to be presented in the same space, we need to sort of explore them a little bit deeper to understand how that can be. So before we get to that, let's step back even in Parshas Bahar. It's interesting that Parshas Bahar is called Parshas Bahar in the first place. Because really, what is the significance of coming to the desert? It's that we're coming specifically to Midbar Sinai. So if I was choosing the name of this parsha and I wanted it to represent the parsha and to represent something sort of special and singular about it, instead of calling it Bahar, which just means at any mountain, I would call it Parsha Sinai, or maybe even Bahar Sinai. There are parshas that have two names. So it would make more sense to call it Parsha Sinai instead of Parshas Bahar. So why is it that we call it Parshas Bahar? And not only that, let's think about this more. If it was called Sinai, it would actually fit with Bechukaisai better. Because what is the main quality that we talk about Har Sinai and that all the children sing about as we come closer to Shavuos? It's about little Har Sinai, who says, I know I'm not tall, I know I'm not wide. I'm not fitting to give the Torah. And what is that if not the ultimate surrendering of self, the ultimate bittul of self, not recognizing its own grandeur, right? So it seems that if we did call it Parsha Sinai, it would make a lot more sense fitting with Parshas Bechukaisai. So why is it that it is actually called Bahar? So again, we have Sinai, which represents this idea of shiflos, of lowliness. And then we have Bahar, which is the opposite of Hagba'ah, of raising myself up on the mountain. And, you know, there's actually, we spoke about this. When did we speak about this? We spoke about it sometime this year. I can't remember in relation to what specifically. But we spoke about the fact that a Talmud Chacham needs to have an 80th of Gaiva. And that there is space, like we said, to have some element of Gaiva. And then we spoke about how without any Gaiva, without any sense of self, you don't actually do anything. That is sort of the driving force within a person, is that little bit of a sense of self. If I was completely selfless, then I wouldn't take myself seriously at all. And when I don't take myself seriously at all, then I don't do anything. Someone who has a vision, someone who has a sense of responsibility, they actually get things done. So that's sort of channeling Gaiva in a positive way, or Hagba'ah, of raising yourself up in a positive way. So how is it that these, we're going to explore a little bit more what exactly bittul is. What exactly bittul is and how it works, and what space do we have for being like a mountain as well. So often bittul is taught as, abnegation of self. I do not exist. Only God exists. I do not exist. And therefore I am very lowly. I'm very low. I'm not important. I'm nothing. But really, if we think about this, how is the bittul created? Where does it come from? Where does this sense of surrender come from? What am I surrendering to? What I am surrendering to is God's greatness. The reason I am surrendering is because I am aware of God's greatness. And the greater my awareness of God's greatness, the greater my surrender is going to be. The more sophisticated my understanding of Hashem's oneness and absoluteness is, the more intensely I am able to surrender myself to that. Right? When I am in the face of, if you've taken a boat out into the middle of the ocean, and you're like literally in the middle of the ocean, so all you see around you is water. When you're within that vastness of the water, or you look through a telescope and you see how many billions of gajillions of stars there are, right? These are experiences that they're not super intellectual, they're not, super sophisticated. But what do they invoke within us when we find ourselves within immense vastness? It creates a feeling of smallness. Not in a way of, excuse me. Is it coming? We're not done. Never mind. Maybe. What? Yeah, but it's like hanging out up. So, but that brings a feeling. Like really, if you would go into that feeling of what it feels like to be in that space. I know for myself that feeling like when it's a good meditation. It's a feeling of being so small and insignificant within the vastness of the world. But it's not a feeling of it's not a negative feeling of smallness, right? It doesn't feel bad. It doesn't feel yucky. We don't feel uncomfortable in our skin in that state. It's just it's a certain feeling of surrendering to something that's bigger than me. I am surrendered to the world, that the world is bigger than me. And then how much more so when we start to recognize that really all of that is literally just the teeniest drop of a 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 drop, endless drop of God's light and energy. And God's light and energy is only a drop of 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 who God is. Right? So that entire world is just the most minute, we can't even express, infinitely small fraction of God's essence. So before the face of God, how much more so is that sense of surrender, is that sense of, I am just a speck in this universe. But what is driving that is not because I am lacking. What's driving that is because God is so great. And what is even going to take it a step further is the fact that God has created me with a purpose and with a mission. So I am just a drop within the vast universe. I am nothing within the vast universe. And at the same time, I am imbued with the absolute responsibility of fulfilling God's will in this world. And that is the experience of Bittul. That is the experience of Bittul. It's completely connected to the responsibility that is connected to the vastness of God's greatness. So the same thing that is making me ultimately small is also making me ultimately expanded and ultimately large, and allowing me to express the deepest element within myself, which is God. So the bittul is to Hashem and also to my own neshama, to the core of my own neshama. That the external layers of myself that feel so real and feel like they take up so much space all the time, and in their taking up of space, divert me from what I really need to be doing because they have all of these other needs and wants and, the endless obsessive loops of our Nefesh Bahamas consciousness, which is constantly just pursuing itself. And I'm surrendering that part of myself to the part of myself that is godly, to the part of myself that is absolutely united with Hashem. And I think this is like really the most important point. You cannot have bittul without having the greatness of Hashem. You cannot have surrender without the understanding of God. And sometimes we attempt this in the wrong order. We attempt to nullify ourselves to something, but then you're nullifying yourself to nothing. And then you are nothing, actually. And then you don't do anything, like we said before, right? Then you're just, you become lost completely. And we know that if God created you, he doesn't want you to become lost completely. If God created you, that means that he has a purpose for you in this world. And we're not supposed to just sit back and let the world do its own thing because I'm nothing. We're supposed to allow this feeling of smallness to drive our actions, to drive our responsibility. And so, we asked, why isn't the parsha called Sinai? Sinai, for itself, is just the recognition of I am lowly, I am small. Sinai is just that feeling of being within the ocean. Right? That feeling of when I'm within the ocean, I am small. Does that create a feeling of responsibility for me? No. Does that connect me to greatness? No. It's just this feeling of this recognition that if I put myself into perspective, I am nothing. I am stardust, if you want to say, right? That's sort of the scientific approach. I'm nothing. We're all recycled matter. But then we connect Sinai to Har, to Bahar Sinai. That means we're connecting it to that Hagba'ah that is connected to truth. And so then I am small because God is so great, right? I am small because God is so great. But then if we want to take it to an even further level, I am not even small because I am so aligned with God that I am only great. Which for most of us is not something we're going to experience as a constant state of being, because we do still feel ourselves as independent from Hashem. When you feel yourself like a tzaddik who is truly synchronized with God and is feeling themselves completely as one with God, they're Bahar. They are only greatness. There's no need for the lowliness. There's no need to ever be like, oh, there's no imposter syndrome there. Right? As long as the imposter syndrome is there, that's a sign that you're still there. Because God doesn't have imposter syndrome. Right? So if there's imposter syndrome, when I think you see it coming up a lot, like that is the Yetzer Hara that comes up around doing good things. I know I've experienced this many times. Like I have a drive, I have a desire, I have a vision to do something in the world. And what comes into my head? Like, who are you to do this thing? Or who are you to teach this? Who are you to think that you understand this? That only comes from a space of feeling separate from God. Right? There's me as an individual separate from God who is very imperfect, and therefore I feel all of this sense of imposter syndrome. But if I'm able to, how do I transcend that? How do I transcend that? Is by shifting my focus and saying, if I am doing this really for the right reasons, that doesn't matter. If I am doing it for the right reasons, it doesn't matter that I am small because I'm really great, because I am really one with God. It's a hard space to come to, because you sort of lose a lot of the excuses. That's part of why surrendering to our own godliness is so hard. We have so much resistance to that, is because so many of our excuses in life to not do what we need to do is coming from that space of false humility, of who am I? I'm so small. I'm not such a good person. I know myself. I know that I have these negative desires. I know, I'm constantly second guessing my intentions all the time. And that's ego. That's Yetzer Hara, and it plays itself off as humility. And true humility is when that doesn't even come into my consciousness anymore. But at the same time, even though we're not all going to reach this level all the time, there is a space in our lives, and we're not going to reach this level all the time, of being in the state of just Bahar, right? Bahar without the Sinai at all, right? The complete state of Hagba'ah, of elevation and expansion, only because I am completely and totally synchronized with godliness. That's tough. And I'm probably not going to be there all the time. I can have moments of it, but it's probably not going to be my regular state of being. But every Jew has this ability to tap into this when we recognize that I am a walking representation of God. When it comes to that, it's easier to do this when it comes to like the world around us. When it comes to Jewish pride, when it comes to sticking with our convictions, even when the world is telling us that our convictions are wrong. When it comes to people trying to push us down for our religious identity, that's when we can feel the sense of Bahar very strongly. No, I'm not going to be quiet. I'm not going to be the quiet little mouse in the corner that's trying to hide. I'm going to come with strength. I'm going to come as a mountain. I'm going to come with my full presence. Why? Because I represent Hashem. I'm a walking representation of the King of Kings, and the representative of the King of Kings doesn't cower in the corner. The representative of the King of Kings has pride. in who they are all the time, and is not threatened by opinions that seem to be different, or that from, the worldview that seems to lack respect for what I represent. And so, like the Rebbe says, we obviously dina de malchus dina applies. It's a law, right? That the law of the land is the law. So no cheating on your taxes. It's the law of the land. That's not the Jewish way. But when the law of the land threatens who we are and our value system, then we need to approach with strength. And it's not necessarily just the official law of the land. We're talking about the general atmosphere of the world around us. When it threatens who we are and it bumps up against who we are, that's where we need to activate very strongly this sense of mountain, of strength in strength and knowing. The strength is completely in knowing, not because I'm a good spokesperson and I know how to speak well, and therefore I can speak up for the Jewish people. My strength comes from the fact that I represent God. That's where my strength comes from, that I represent Hashem. And when we understand this, we understand that there really is not a contradiction between these two parshias. There's not a contradiction between the chukim, between the concept of letting go of myself and the concept of being great. They really go hand in hand. That the more I am able to understand Hashem's greatness, the more I can surrender to it and then channel it within myself. The more I could surrender to the greatness of my neshama, to the light of my essential godly self. So they're not a contradiction. It's only a contradiction if you're approaching it as false humility, because false humility doesn't have space for greatness. But true humility and true surrender to God has space for greatness and goes hand in hand with greatness. And it's interesting, these parshias are taking us into Matan Torah. And every year, in general, before we receive the Torah, in general, before learning Torah, there needs to be a sense of bittul. There needs to be a sense of, I'm going into something that's a little bit bigger than me. A friend of mine actually just told me last night, she recently changed her view of learning Torah. Instead of looking to see what I can get out of the Torah that I'm learning, I look at it to see, what is the Torah going to teach me? And so often we approach the Torah with all of our own schema of everything, the whole package that we come with, and we want to define things within these parameters that we've understood. And sometimes those parameters are even the things that our Jewish culture has told us is true. But the Torah is not actually saying that. Like it's not just like personal stuff. It sometimes can be a cultural thing. And before Matan Torah, what we need to try to do as we come to Har Sinai is have this balance of letting go of my own preconceived notions. And that allows me to really get in touch with the expansiveness and the greatness of the Torah. When I come from this limited space of self, then there's very little space for Torah to enter into me in a big way. My understanding is always going to be limited. When I let go of myself and I approach it with this bittul of, I had a teacher in Israel who is probably one of the more impactful learning experiences I've had in my life, where he came in and he was just substituting. And the first class that he taught, he came in and we were like high level learning in the learning space. We're so smart, blah, blah, blah. That was sort of the headspace that we were in at that time. And he came in and gave a class that literally no one understood what he was talking about. Nothing. We were like, oh gosh, he's coming back again. Like, it was very Kabbalistic. It was like very cryptic. We just didn't get it. And then the next class he came in and gave one of like the most actually transformative classes I've ever heard in my life. When I'm saying that, I'm totally serious. It's probably one of the things that really changed my view on life. And he said, in part of the process of his teaching over the next few weeks, he told us that before students can learn, they need to surrender. And so his sort of very practical way of accomplishing that was first to make us realize that we don't necessarily understand everything and we don't know everything, and that we can be very confused and we won't, and like there's so many limits to our knowledge. And then the following class, we can be open to learning. Because we've recognized that within ourselves and let go of that part of ourselves. And that opens us up. And that's sort of like what we need to do as we approach Matan Torah, is open ourselves up to receiving the Torah in a very true and real way, that it's not going to be an imposition upon us. It's not just going to, how many times have we seen interpretations of Torah that people say that are just to feed their own agendas? And we all know when that happens, and we all sense the inauthenticity in that, and we all know that Torah is so much bigger than that. And the concept of bechukaisai, the Alter Rebbe connects the word chukim, of the laws that don't make sense, to the language of chakika. Chakika means engraved. We know that the luchais were engraved. So unlike parchment, which is, there's parchment and then there's the ink, and the words sort of sit above the parchment. With engraving, the words and the material that they are engraved in are completely one. You can't separate them from each other, right? They're carved out of the thing itself. When we approach the Torah from this place of chayk meaning that I am entering into this intellectual study, which means I need to be present somehow. My brain needs to be here. But at the same time, what I'm learning really transcends intellect. That's what it means, right? I'm going to use my brain to attempt to encapsulate something that doesn't fit in it, something that is so much greater than it. That's learning in the manner of hakika. That's learning in the manner of, that's when it's really able to become engraved within us, because I'm not telling it what it needs to be, and I'm not defining it by what it needs to be. It's coming to tell me what it is. And when it comes to tell me what it is, why is it at the end of the day that I am able to understand it if it truly transcends intellect? Is because at the core of my soul is a piece of God. At the core of my soul is godliness. So therefore, this is not really learning something new, it's memory. It's activation of memory. When we learn in this way, we're allowing ourselves to activate our godly soul's memory of already having this experience, of already knowing the Torah. And that's that certain resonance that we have when we learn in this way. This feeling that like it feels so true. It doesn't, I don't need to necessarily even, I can't explain it with my brain of why it feels so true. It's not an emotional feeling. It's like this deep, essential feeling of truth and deep, essential feeling of connection. And that is the chakika. And just to finish off one last point about this, another interesting thing is that in the Parsha of Bechukaisai, it talks about a bunch of different mitzvahs and their rewards, and also the punishments if you don't keep the rewards. Not if you don't keep the rewards. The punishments if you don't, there's the rewards if you keep the mitzvahs and the punishments if you don't. And we might think that that sort of contradicts this whole concept, because in a Torah that's very much imposed upon us, then when we do the right thing, what happens? We get a reward. And when we do the wrong thing, we get an X, right? And we live. And when Torah is being imposed upon us and I approach it as a checklist, I'm doing the good things to get the checks, and I'm not doing the bad things, not to get the minuses and not to get the punishment. But by putting the reward and punishment into this parsha under this name of Bechukaisai, it's actually shifting our whole understanding of what reward and punishment is. Reward and punishment is not something that just exists for itself, like the example of a person who's going to work, right? Our relationship with Torah and mitzvahs and with Hashem is not that we are his workers, that we get paid when we do something good, and if you don't show up to work, your pay gets docked, you get punished for not showing up. No, our relationship with Hashem is a relationship of hakika. It's a relationship of engraving, which means that the same way when you're in a relationship with someone who you really care about and who you're completely and feel totally one with your children, with your spouse, that relationship seeps into every single part of your life, right? And it expresses itself in every single part of your life. And it's always on your mind, right? It's like completely and totally all-encompassing. That's the role of reward and punishment. to bring this relationship into every single part of my life. And when the relationship is going well, I feel it in every single part of my life. And when the relationship is not going well, it also seeps into every single part of my life. Right? When my relationship is not going well, it's going to go into my job performance because it's an all-encompassing relationship. It's completely and totally part of me. And so our relationship with reward and punishment is not that it's some external motivational system. It's that understanding that, no, we are together and it's going to impact every part of us. And there's going to be, when it's positive, it's going to be positive for everything. And when it's negative, it's going to be negative for everything. Because it's this all-consuming, enmeshed relationship with Hashem. So I think this is just like very fitting, first of all, with Parsha, but also, like I said before, going into Shavuos, it's what type of Torah are we coming to accept on Shavuos? We're bringing in a new Torah to Mayan for Shavuos. And sometimes when you see the physical new Torah, it's like it makes it very real to us that, you know, we have a chance to accept a new Torah this year. As we come into Shul, here at Zrkind, we have a chance to really accept the Torah anew. And even if you've been learning the same Torah for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, you have a chance to reestablish that relationship, to come into it. The Torah has so much more to teach you. The Torah has so much more to teach you. If we come into it with a sense of humility and with a sense of openness, it's endless what we can learn. So yeah, we should all have that accept a new Torah.